So I remember taking off on a plane last summer to spend my time volunteering in a refugee camp in Greece. And I remember sitting on the plane and thinking about what my friends and close family had said to me right before I left. And a lot of it was, Claire, please be safe, and be careful, and travel safely. And when I got there, I had no idea the kind of connections I would make. And actually, I want to tell you the story of 5 boys who I ended up being closest with before I left. And 4 of them are from Syria, and 1 is from Iraq. And they hadn't known each other before they got there, but they act like brothers, and they call each other brothers. And after playing lots of soccer and going out to several lunches, they had called me their sister by the end of my trip. And I remember exactly my last night there. We had stayed up till sunrise, and we watched the sun rise over Turkey because the island's right on the coast. And one of the boys looked at me, and all of them are Muslim, and he asked me, "Can I pray for you?" And it was this astounding moment because I had never been prayed for before. And I was like, "Yes, of course, thank you so much, but can you tell me why?" And he was like, "Well, we treat you like our sister, and you're flying away in the morning, and I just want you to be safe, be careful, and travel safely home." And I realized, coming from someone who didn't have a safe passage ahead of them, and someone my age who I considered my friend who calls me their sister, for them to give me the humanity of praying for my safe passage home that I had guaranteed, I realized that someone who came in this is an individual who got lost. And got lost in ways that doesn't reflect how we see them in a negative light, but instead how we can empathize and understand their situation. So many people lose security by stepping on these boats. Each of those 5 boys, my friends, had to step on one of those boats to be able to get and not know where they were going to go. And just to put it in perspective, I think the way we look at refugees is that they're independent and they become extremely self-sufficient after all that they've gone through. And I think, to give a good example, I met this one boy from Congo, and I worked a lot in the children's projects there, and he's 10 to 11 years old, and everyone knows him. Everyone knows him. He causes the most havoc in the camp. He will come tug on your hair, and he causes every project of yours to have problems. And I also see this volatile temper in him, and a lot of volunteers don't like him, and they don't like working with him. But then you also see this side of this kid who instead comes up and hugs you and asks how your day is and is kind to you. And so one time, there's this one volunteer that's really good at working with him, and I asked, what's his story? Like, how did he get here? It's just like this young kid. And he was in a family camp, so I assumed he was with his parents. But I learned how independent you have to become as a refugee when a 10 to 11-year-old boy left his home without his parents and traveled through the north of Africa and decided to step on a boat and find his way to Lesbos. No one asked him along the way if he had eaten that day, if he drank something, or how he even felt about being away from his parents. And by volunteers not having the patience with him, I had to remind myself that I wasn't, too, giving him that attention. I wasn't paying attention to how he was feeling. And so I think when we talk about refugees, we also don't pay attention to the rhetoric that we have about them, and as they are just individuals. And when I heard people talk a lot about refugees, I heard, they're a burden, and I understand that we all recognize the humanitarian crisis, but to consider someone that's a burden and they're sitting in this position of limbo in a camp where they can't go forward and they can't go backwards, and it's all dependent upon what papers they have and what the government says about them, I have not seen that. And instead I see people like this one boy from Afghanistan, his 2 brothers, and they're about my age. They honestly could have been my classmates. And, I was in town with him one day, and he was telling me that he was the best in his class in computer science. And might I mention, he said this in perfect English. And he was the best in his class, computer science in Afghanistan. And the reason that he had to flee was because he said something against the government on a TV show that his family owned. And, he's in this position. I asked him, if you got the chance to study, would you? And he's like, you have no idea how much I want to go back to school. And also, in his free time, since he's not in education, what he actually does is him and his two brothers make documentaries that explain the situation, how people feel in these camps. They go through and they put names and faces in their documentaries, and they still themselves live in the camp. And they've borrowed material from town and created themselves as a place in the community. And they live here. And when reporters go, and I heard when I was there that PBS was doing a documentary on Lesbos, and I watched it afterwards, right before this TED Talk, and I noticed that they went to this pile of life jackets that I showed earlier, and everyone talks about the distress and the disruption of the situation, but no one talks about this. No one shows stories like this, and what is this? This is a project that was started and continues to run by refugees. About every week, a bunch of refugees and volunteers together go and collect life jackets, bring them down to the center of town, wash them, and create this activist project to be able to tell people their story and create something from what everyone in the news considers to be hopeless and a symbol of hopelessness into something new. And in fact, all the proceeds that go to these are given to the people that make them, or else people that are refugees that are trying to tell their story and create work for themselves, to feed their family or give them a little bit of extra money and feel normal. And so, I came back, and I'm so grateful that I have the chance to talk about this with TEDx, because I thought about how I would tell these stories and how people might be able to understand these characters I was saying. And I realized, even with my own friends, that it was so difficult to explain how, people are being self-sufficient and whatnot. And I realized that I really didn't give anything when I went substantially to the refugees. And I felt this pit in my stomach, like I hadn't given anyone asylum. I couldn't give them a ticket to go see their family. I couldn't give them things that were essential. However, what I did give and what I found was that I lost and I left a piece of myself on Lesbos to find solidarity with refugees. I gave them hope that you can make friends all around the world in a place where you've lost almost everything that is your support network. We gave each other a connection that came from two extremely different cultures, perhaps, but in the same sense, in a place that they cannot move, in limbo, you gave something that can grow into something good. And I think if we change the conversation about the refugee crisis into seeking solidarity, and for people to not be so fearful of going and helping refugees thinking they can't do anything, you in fact do. You make connections, and that itself is enough. Because what you do is that you give someone the right to feel like they're a part of a community again, and feel as though they can continue giving and going forward in their own life without having the idea that they're a lost cause by everyone else in the world. And I think if everyone thought like that, we'd be in a much better place than we are now in the refugee crisis. And so I encourage you to try and find yourself in a conversation with people talking about refugees, and try and find ways to express solidarity. And instead of saying, oh, how sad, oh, how pitiful, instead express how there are people that are strangers and friends and brothers and people that, even for me, call me their sister after barely knowing them. And because of that, I challenge you to find solidarity and think of the refugee crisis in a way that is an opportunity for all of us to have patience and pay attention. So I want to finish with just this idea that we have in the camps. And it's on Lesbos. Before you leave, nobody really says goodbye between refugees and volunteers. We instead exchange contacts, look at each other, and say, you know what? I'll see you soon. Thank you.